Hi, good morning. I think there's just a small button in the corner just went live, so I think that is us live. So my name is Ciarán Casey. I wasn't checking out to remember my name. I meant to say thank you so much to the BSTAI for coordinating with the Chemistry School in Limerick today. So we're delighted to be doing it. These are really interesting, kind of important lectures for us. So great to be here. And also, yeah, thank you to the teachers and students participating this morning. It's great to have you. I think we've quite a short timeline today, so I'll bang into it. I'm going to do kind of just under half an hour, and then if people can fire in questions, that'd be great. We can do a Q&A at the end, but I know people kind of have to run off towards the end, so that's absolutely fine. And also hello to anyone who kind of uses this afterwards. Glad it's of use. So I'm going to do, my name is Ciarán Casey. I'm an economic historian, particularly focusing on Irish history. So I'm going to look today at largely inflation and lessons from the 1970s. Mary, can I get the next slide, please? So when you look at kind of the economy, when you're going through, sorry, I'm still on the first slide. Thank you. Sorry, I love this. It's an evergreen reminder that inflation doesn't hit all sectors equally. So yeah, poor freelance writers being expected to write, 800-word articles for the same price they were paid 15 years ago. Just again, there's a truth here. Next slide, please, Mary. Grant. So when we're looking at indicators for the economy, I think there's always three kind of big classic ones that you'd use. So one is GDP, which I'm not going to go and explain to you now, but obviously you'll know by now there are plenty of problems with GDP as it pertains to Ireland. Most countries, GDP and GNP and everything's kind of much the same. There traditionally was only about a 2% variance, whereas in Ireland it's now huge. I think our GDP is up around 450 billion, and our GNI star, kind of modified, pulling out the distorting effects of the multinationals, is only about 250 billion. And you can see as well, that's a huge spike in 2015. That's the year Paul Krugman labelled us leprechaun economics, and it was probably just one big multinational moving a bunch of intellectual property here. Anyway, long and short of it is GDP is a mixed indicator when it comes to Ireland. It's of kind of limited value at this point. Next slide. So this is, much more modern. You can see it's a much smoother progression. So modified GNI, so this is the CSO, kind of at the behest of Europe, came up with an indicator that would kind of remove a lot of the turbulence from the multinationals and give just a much better indication of living standards in Ireland. So, the long and short of it, what GNI star shows as our modified GNI is, Ireland's a rich, wealthy Western European country. It's just not as astronomically wealthy as you would think, and you don't have these huge kind of spikes of 20% increases in 2015 and so on. Next slide, please. Another indicator that people use a lot, and I think is a very kind of strong indicator, is unemployment. It's a very good indicator of kind of how your economy is doing. And you can see, over the last kind of 15 years, unemployment in Europe, in the Eurozone and in Ireland has been incredibly turbulent. So during the Great Recession, it spikes, I think, here to the peak of 15.9% in Ireland. But you can see again in Europe and the Euro area, because the Euro area contains countries like Italy, Spain and so on, which have had very bad unemployment. The whole Euro area is a very kind of turbulent employment data for the last 15 years. And you can see so that huge big spike is the Great Recession, and that much smaller spike is COVID. But again, those numbers are kind of massaged because of state interventions and so on. Next slide, please. So the indicator that, that's Ireland. So yeah, again, so just under 16%. Back in, this was in the late or the early 1990s. We headed into the 1990s with kind of high or kind of middle teens unemployment, and people expected that it'd still be around 14% by 2000, but with this massive boom in the 90s. So it fell really dramatically. We kind of bounced along the bottom around 4%. It's about as low as Ireland's ever got. And, a pickup, a huge spike again after the Great Recession. No one expected the Great Recession, well, in that kind of scale, and absolutely no one expected we'd be able to pull unemployment back down as quickly as as we did, we all kind of thought that it'd stick around for an awful long time and pull down very quickly, and then sure a little bit of an increase during COVID, or if you hadn't had PCP and things like that, a big increase, but fortunately fairly short term. Next slide, please. So the one indicator that has been really hard to teach for the last certainly 10 years is inflation, because we didn't really have it. Inflation in Ireland and in the euro area, I mean, I've only got as far as 2019, was hovering around kind of 1 or 2%. So it was barely there. I mean, it just wasn't really in people's consciousness. And then you can really see it clearly there from the start of kind of 2021. There's been an enormous spike in inflation. So in the EU at close to 12%, which is just really high historically compared to the last couple of decades. Next slide. You can see here, and the next slide will do it as well, what is driving this is really clear from the data, is energy. So this is annual inflation in the euro area up to last month over the previous year, and energy prices have gone up over 34%. And next after that is food, and then kind of harmonized consumer prices is only around 10%. But the next slide. The next slide, it shows really clearly, this is the timeline, and it's showing, so the red line there is energy, and it shows, so energy was actually falling until kind of late 2020, energy prices, but then there's a serious spike in energy, and energy just lifts up much quicker than anything else. And the thing about energy, so oil particularly, is oil isn't like something else going up in price. Oil, because it underpins so much manufacturing and you can't move anything without oil, we all have to heat our houses and everything like that. Oil price increases permeate through the rest of the economy incredibly quickly, and they have a huge effect. It's not like something else like increasing concrete or rubber or something. It's just it's an incredible impact on the rest of the economy. And then food followed quite quickly afterwards, because there's huge kind of energy components in food. Next slide, please. Grant. So what's fascinating, everyone obviously discusses this in terms of, it's Russia and it's the invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions that the EU imposed on Russia. And look, to a large extent, that's true. But it's interesting if you look at always with stuff like this. I mean, look, break it down. So if you look at the countries, so on the right hand side, so these are Estonia has the highest, so these are inflation rates up to September over the previous year. So Estonia has the highest rate, which you'd expect. It's beside Russia, it's up at 24%, Lithuania next 22.5%, Latvia. That's fine, you expect that. What's really interesting if you look on the left hand side, so France has very, very low inflation. France is very energy independent. It's an awful lot of nuclear energy. Malta, you'd expect, far away from Russia. What's absolutely bizarre then is Finland. And I haven't found a good explanation for Finland's right beside Russia. You would expect that it to have fairly significant trade links with Russia, and yet the inflation hasn't passed on. So there's something else going on there. Maybe it's, Finland has fewer trade links with Russia or whatever the issue is. I haven't been able to work it out, but it's always a more complicated picture than it's kind of depicted in the news. And then you can see Ireland next, 8.6%. So for all of the talk of inflation and the cost of living crisis here, it's about a third of what it is in Estonia, and it's 2%, 2.5% lower than it is in the euro area overall. Next slide, please. Grant. So causes, I mean, if you go kind of looking for broader causes and what's driving all this, so there are three, I think, that really strike me. So one is you've still got clogged up supply chains after lockdown. You had 2 years of things not throughout the world economy not flowing as they were meant to, and you pent-up demand. So, I mean, this is definitely kicking through in terms of things like, tourism definitely in terms of pent-up demand is there. Building supplies building costs here are up by about a third, and that predated, that came before the Ukraine war. I know I've literally painters downstairs at the moment wrecking my life. Doing a renovation, you learn very quickly if input prices go up, and they went up before lockdown or before the invasion, so that's causing issues. And it's things like construction here as well. It's very much an issue. The war in Ukraine and associated sanctions. I mean, definitely, Russia's such a big gas exporter, particularly into Europe, and that's causing huge issues as well. There's no denying it. It's just not the only thing. And the last thing, which is really interesting, and there's been more in the news about it recently, but we don't really get the full implications here is just persistent lockdowns in China. So in the summer, there were cities in China with 74 million people in them under serious strict lockdown, like much stricter than what we had. There's huge congestion in Chinese ports. Again, if you think of China as like the workshop of the world, and there's just stuff bunged up in Chinese ports. It's been sitting there for years. And next slide, please. And this, if you look at the COVID numbers, isn't going away. So, I mean, so this is a new spike. So these are daily COVID reported cases in Shanghai. So this is, I mean, literally from the start of November and back up at peak levels. I mean, they're going through a massive spike now. Next slide, please. And again, that's repeated through kind of Beijing and so on. I mean, it's all, China is in real trouble in terms of COVID at the moment. Next slide. So again, I mean, this is how I'm sure you've seen images and news reports of the protests over there. They're having serious protests, which is kind of a problem. And they've responded. This was only literally from the last couple of days. They've responded by easing their COVID policy and reducing lockdowns. So that's going to have implications in terms of, yeah, fine that, you know, the economy might open up a bit more than it has, and it might, but in the short term. But also, I mean, COVID's not going anywhere, and by reducing lockdowns, you know, you're just potentially storing up further problems. So the Chinese element is still there for the time being. Next slide, please. So in terms of just to pull back a little bit, what causes inflation, a really good way I think about it all the time. So Milton Friedman got plenty right, plenty wrong. But that line, too much money chasing too few goods, I always think of it in those terms. So it's change in the relationship between money and goods. Okay, so if you've an increase in the amount of money in circulation or a decrease on one side of the equation, or on the other side, you've got more or fewer goods. And then, yeah, if you've a fall in the number of goods and the amount of money holds tight, well then that's what causes inflation. The actual formula, I don't know if it's on the syllabus, but MV equals PQ. So M is money supply, the amount of money is in circulation. V is the velocity of money, which is how frequently money changes hands within a year. P is the price of goods and services, and Q is the quantity of goods and services. So if you keep the money supply and the velocity of money solid on one side of the equation, and if there's a change in the quantity of goods and services, then there has to be a corresponding change in the price of goods and services. Okay, that's the way to think about it. Next slide, please. Grant, what's really interesting, I mean, you don't need to know all these, I'm showing off that I actually did the work on it. It's really interesting, the impact of inflation on growth. So the way that, again, kind of the media depiction of it, or the textbook depiction of it, is that, you know, inflation is hugely harmful to growth and at very low levels. Actually, the evidence is more mixed than that. So, I mean, some people will argue, you know, that kind of inflation will start to hurt growth in kind of high single digits, around 7.84% was one figure given that Han study down near the bottom. There's other arguments. So there's this Bill Easterly paper from 1998, and they're going, there's no robust evidence annual inflation below 40% lowers growth. Now, to me, that sounds really, really high. I'd expect serious impacts on growth by that point. But I just mean that the evidence base is weaker than people think it is. Bizarrely, and for various reasons, that inflation, poorer countries, developing countries, seem to be able to deal better with higher inflation. It's less of an impact on growth than it does in wealthier countries, which is something which I'm not fully across why it happens. One thing Milton Friedman suggested was probably what matters less is the rate of inflation than changes in the rate of inflation. So if you've got kind of 10% a year, you can potentially live with that. But if it's kind of huge increases in that year on year on year, then that's where it becomes really difficult. Next slide, please. And I mean, just always a perpetual reminder. So Korea, essentially, South Korea achieved, I mean, essentially the best growth performance of any country in history, between kind of post World War II, but certainly between kind of 1960 and the late 1970s. And the US was kind of urging it to, you know, really stable, keep your inflation down, and then worry about growth. And Korea went, no, we're just going to go for the growth and damn inflation. So during that period, they had like 1964, inflation peaks at nearly 30%. It's consistently over 10. for years afterwards, and back up to kind of 25% in the 70s. And all the while, it's going from just this really poor. I mean, Korea started kind of 1950 was poorer than a lot of African countries. It started off poorer in North Korea, and now, I mean, it's vastly wealthier. And so again, it's, you know, inflation. It's, I wouldn't just caricature it. It's more complicated than it's depicted. Next slide, please. Mary, can I get the next slide, please? Brilliant. So again, there's an awful lot of discussion about, you know, oh, this is like the 1970s. So what happened in the 70s was there were two world crises, right? So 1973, Israel was invaded by its neighbors, Egypt and Syria. It beat them back. It was largely kind of equipped by the US militarily. The Arabian oil exporting countries, sorry, just a previous one. The Arabian oil exporting countries responded, kind of aided the Egyptian and Syrian war effort by reducing oil supply and by putting embargoes in certain kind of Western countries like the US, I think Norway. So anyway, the price of oil goes up fourfold in a year between 1973 and 74. And Western countries were seriously dependent on oil at this point. The US historically had been kind of, you know, self-sufficient, but they had huge gas guzzling cars, really inefficient houses, and you know, it left them very, very exposed. 1979 is the Iranian Revolution, and prices go up again, and the Shah flees the country, and it kind of interrupts oil supply. The following year, 1980, the Iraq-Iran war, supply falls from both countries. So over the 1970s, oil prices go up tenfold. And to a system like a world economy that's seriously dependent on oil, they're incredibly wasteful with it. You know, people with huge single pane glazing throughout their houses and so on. Or prior to that, that filling an oil tank would cost a couple of quid. So it really hit people. This kicks off in a bunch of Western countries, particularly in 1973, wage price spirals. So, you know, prices get pushed up, like now, you know, you've kind of 10, 15% inflation. People say, well, look, I want a 4% pay increase next year, but I want that on top of inflation. So if inflation is going to be 15%, I want a 19% pay increase. The problem with that is then, you know, those wage increases eat through into prices in the companies in which those people are working. So the following year, inflation isn't 15%, it's, you know, 17%, and then people want a 21% pay increase and so on. And you get these wage price spirals, and they can exist even when the oil price that triggered it all actually falls back down. Okay, so that isn't happening now. So the latest data in the euro area and in the EU is that year-on-year wages are only up 4% or 4.4% in the EU. And again, you remember that this is in the context of inflation of about 10%. So instead of a wage price spiral, real wages are actually falling. So, you know, prices have gone up 10%, and people are only getting 4% pay increases. So the difference is what happened in the 70s. By 1980, apparently the typical American kind of expected that you would have 10% inflation into perpetuity, and that people would do, it's going to be 10% every year. So if I want a pay increase, I want whatever I want, 3-4% pay increase, but I want that on top of the 10%. So you've just got this 10% pay, kind of inflationary expectation embedded into perpetuity. And it took the Federal Reserve in the US serious effort to break that expectation. And we're just obviously not there yet because people aren't demanding to be compensated for this in their wages. And the fear is if you let this kind of slide for too long, that they will be. Those expectations kind of get embedded quite quickly. And that's what central banks are really worried about now. So the ECB and the Fed, that's what they're working on. That's why they're upping interest rates. Next slide, please. So you can see this is in Ireland. This is, and I mean, it's so fascinating. It's the light blue, it's per decade and it's wage increases. And the light blue line, so is nominal earnings growth. This is nominal, it's kind of, you know, not allowing for inflation. It's just, you know, people's pay packets, literally what it says on the title. And you can see in the 1970s, people were getting 18%, 17, 18% nominal earnings growth per year throughout the 1970s. And you go, if you say this to someone who was there at the time, they go, oh, but inflation is really high. It was, but even when you subtract inflation, they were still getting 4.8% a year increases, which is just a kind of profound level of increase. This is in Ireland. Over a decade, because it compounds, that's a 60% pay increase. You can stay in the same job and you're 60%, you're getting 60% more in real terms after inflation in 1980 than you were in 1970. And this is the kind of thing that makes an economy really uncompetitive, because if your neighbours aren't giving out, or your trading partners aren't giving out those kind of pay increases, you're in trouble. Next slide, please. And this was, yeah, I mean, it's a totally different climate again. So this is a picture from the 1970s. Strikes were all over the place. 1979, 1.4 million strike days lost. So, you know, days where people would have been at work, but they're out on strike. And that's with a workforce that was just over 1 million. So, you know, your average person went on strike for more than, or sorry, it's a mean thing, yeah. So, you know, mean strike days of just over, you know, over more strike days lost in 1979 than there were workers in the economy. You compare that to now, and I mean, it's essentially no strikes. It's a totally different workplace environment. Next slide, please. The other thing that people compare this to is, you know, kind of, you know, slightly kind of misinformed commentators will immediately start talking about the 1970s. Really uninformed commentators will just start banging on about the 1920s. So the 1920s, people may have come across, so there's hyperinflation in Germany in the Weimar Republic. This, you know, you get these pictures. This woman here she's burning money in a stove because the money is literally, it's not worth the paper it's printed on. Literally, it's cheaper to burn it than just to buy fuel with it. So actually, the evidence is many countries have graduated away from bouts of runaway inflation. A lot of the reason is we just know not to print way too much money. Think of the MV equation. You know, you just don't massively up the amount of money in the system. But this really looms, this episode looms seriously in the minds of policymakers, and especially German policymakers who are so influential in the ECB. So if you look at the graph at the bottom, so one gold mark in kind of January 1923, I think we're in 1923, was worth about 10,000 paper marks. And you can see what happens over the course of the year. I mean, it just absolutely skyrockets. This kills the German middle class because they would have had savings, but they would have been cash savings and just get completely wiped out. And it just leaves this kind of, you know, transgenerational trauma. Next slide, please. Grant, so one thing you never hear enough about is inflation. There are about winners and losers. So there's people hold, I'm just kind of keeping an eye on time. Okay, we're fine. Winners and losers. So the winners, you never really hear about the winners. Anyone holding debt at fixed interest rates. So if you got your mortgage at 2%, 2.2%, I think Ulster Bank were offering, at a fixed rate for 5 years, and inflation is up around kind of 9%, the real value of your mortgage is being eroded really significantly year on year, you know, by 7%. 3 years of that, and you've wiped off nearly a quarter of the value of your mortgage. It's a serious kind of benefit to people who've got debt on fixed interest rates, and you never hear about that. And people who have these mortgages don't really realize it themselves, you know. And say if you've got, you know, it means if you've got a mortgage of 400,000, for example, that knocks 100 grand off the value within a couple of years. And you know, there's people, if you offered them 100 grand, they'd be absolutely thrilled and delirious, and they'd be delighted. This happens, they don't even know that it's happened. You know, so again, if you're holding debt at fixed interest rates, you're doing very well out of this. Energy exporting countries are doing great, and you know, firms that sell energy, and you know, you've got, I think the oil was a real serious low before all this, was about kind of, you know, 18 to 20 quid a barrel. It's kind of peaked at about 120. It's down to about 80 now, but they're making a lot more money than they were. And you know, there's serious fears that actually Russia's done really well out of all this, perversely, because it pushed up so dramatically the cost of oil internationally, and now they could just sell their oil to other people for more money than they were in the first place. Which is not a reason not to have an embargo, but it is a problem. The losers, anyone holding cash, because you know, if inflation across the Eurozone is 10% a year, the value of any cash you're holding is being eroded by 10% a year. You do not want to be holding significant amounts of cash at the moment, or have it in your bank account. Workers and businesses whose income doesn't keep pace. We've looked at this. So you know, the average worker's earnings, or the average, you know, wages are only going up by 4% across the Eurozone. So most workers are really losing out here, you know, by kind of 5-6% a year. It's significant. You just hope it doesn't last for too long. And most businesses, and I mean, this is why they're closing. There's cafes and restaurants closing around me all the time at the moment. It's very bleak. Because they can't push on the price increases. There was a burger place closed because it's very expensive to keep all the ovens and stuff going. The energy costs are really high, and it just can't pass on the prices. So that's killing them. Energy importing countries, really important. So a country like Ireland, because we import virtually all of our energy, there's a shift in the terms of trade. That's the way to think about it. So in 1973, before the first oil crisis, oil imports represent 2.6% of Irish GNP, and it's up to 7.6% a year later. So Ireland as a society is just 5% poorer. And there's no getting around that. There's no there's no changing that. Next slide, please. So similarly, this time, Ireland, because we're a net energy importer, we are just as a society, we're a couple of percent poorer. Okay. The fiscal policy lesson of the 1970s is you can't insulate all of society from the impact of this indefinitely. So, the state can kind of, subsidize for a year or two. They really put themselves into an awful lot of trouble in the 1970s. I mean, they borrowed in 1974 as much money as they had, and far from abroad, the state borrowed as much money as it had in all of the years since World War II. Foreign borrowing just spiked massively. It kicked them into huge problems in the 1970s and 1980s. The real lesson is you just don't do that. You just suck up the couple of percentage point fall in living standards. We're probably only back to where we were a couple of years ago. For most people, it's manageable. The ECB, the European Central Bank, expects this all to be over relatively quickly, so we shouldn't try. Definitely insulate low-income households because they're least able to withstand it. Richie Ryan, who was minister from 73 to 77, Minister for Finance, asked people for common sense, a little patience, and more give and less take. In other words, a readiness to forgo a little today for a better tomorrow, which is something I think we should remember. Next slide, please. At a European level, so again, the European Central Bank, its first mandate, so the Federal Reserve in the US has a price stability mandate and a growth mandate. It's like you need to keep prices stable, but you also need to focus on growth. The ECB's absolute headline mandate is you need price stability. Price stability first, growth second. So their target they set themselves is 2%. Okay, because inflation's up around 10%, they've obviously, as we all know, they've been pushing up interest rates. It's the first time they've done that in 11 years. So it's the first increase since 2011, and they've been pushing up really solidly. We're expecting one in the next kind of 2 weeks, I think, or next week. Actually, it's pretty much coming around the corner, and it should be significant enough. Again, it'll be kind of 0.5 to 0.75%. The ECB is committed to getting inflation back to 2% in the medium term, and they're predicting it'll be 2.1% in 2024. Newsflash, it probably won't, but you want to get it down off kind of 10% in the euro area as quickly as you can, so that you don't get those price expectations and inflationary expectations embedded, because then it's its own problem. Oil prices can go back to where they were, but you still have kind of wage price spirals, so you really don't want that. Obviously, pushing up interest rates, there's going to be employment effects. I mean, that's a feature. It's not a bug. You're intentionally pushing up interest rates to deflate, spending and investment and so on, reduce people's spending capacity. You're trying to dampen the economy, but it's better than just letting the inflation kind of run rampant. And this is going to have an impact in countries with high levels of public debt and hangovers from the Great Recession. So Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Ireland. Next slide, please. So yeah, the outcomes, they really depend here. So fortunately, so far, we're having a mild winter up till today, but there's huge variations on impact by country. So you remember, France has been very minimally hit by this. They've loads of nuclear energy. They're kind of okay. Austria, apparently, its homes are heated like kind of 98% or something like that by pipe gas. And the problem with gas is, it's very hard to ship. You can ship oil, but you really need to pipe gas. So you're kind of reliant on the network that you're getting it from. So Austria is exposed and have cold. And if gas supplies are cut properly in the winter, so the European Commission did a study and they kind of reckoned, okay, we expect GDP to fall by 1.5%. This is a great example of where, economists will spend a lot of time talking about the flaws in GDP. This is a great example. It really underestimates the human and societal impact. So if we're all sitting at home shivering all winter and miserable, fine, our output might only decrease very small. We might all, we'll go to work, we'll all do the same things, but, your welfare has been hit by more than 1.5%. It's really having a really miserable winter. The impact of that would be worse. Fortunately, it's been mild so far. Hopefully that continues. Ireland already, so definitely reports a fall off in construction, and construction kind of seemed marginally worthwhile for people before now. It's just so expensive to do, and input prices, which kind of again had gone up before the Ukraine invasion, it's just making it kind of borderline non-viable for people, and consumption is definitely falling already. People are getting impacted, and that's coming through in the data. It comes through anecdotally first, and it's come through in the data in the last couple of months. Is that people, they're dropping their consumption because they're getting squeezed here. A huge lesson from 20 years ago is there's no devaluation option within the Eurozone. So Ireland during the boom, because we were relying so much on construction unemployment, Irish manufacturing wages went up 20% during the boom over German manufacturing wages, right? So the difficulty then is when all the construction industry collapsed, and then people are going looking for jobs, but the wage demands are way too high. We're totally uncompetitive. What you really don't want here is that wage expectations go up here and they don't go up, we start demanding much higher wages, but that's not the same throughout the Eurozone, because if we're left uncompetitive at the end of this, you can't devalue. So you kind of sit there with high unemployment for a long time, waiting for people's wage demands to fall, which they're sticky downwards, so they take a long time to do, and you've got an unemployment overhang. So you don't want to become uncompetitive vis-a-vis our Eurozone partners. Slightly kind of more complicated bit to end on. Next slide, please. I think that's it for me. And this is more it's an image from Weimar Germany and kids flying money kites, because money, again, not worth the paper it's printed on. It was the cheapest thing to make a kite out of. Anyway, that's it from me. Thank you so much. I think I'll look at the Q&A and see if there's any questions. I'd like to know if there are. But thanks a million. No, not seeing any questions there. If anyone has any questions, let me know. Obviously, we just dealt with absolutely everything. Grant, yeah, that's just Mary reminding. So we're going to share all the slides and the recordings on social media. Sorry, that's again getting worked in the night. And recordings through social media and on the KBS website. So thanks a million for joining us. Seriously appreciate it. And I'm glad that the banging in my house is only construction input prices is only kind of hitting now. So it's been brilliant doing this. Much appreciated. And good luck in the exams. And come to Limerick. We'd love to have you. Thanks a million.